Good evening, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the seventh webinar in the extended lockdown webinar series. So that's 14th altogether that we've done, and second last one. So I hope you enjoyed it. And tonight I'm going to talk about something very interesting and different, and a very obscure part of the NK repertoire, and it's about primitive reflex, and specifically the Moro reflex. And this is because I did this talk a long time ago at a conference, and it's it was in the United States, in Washington, around there somewhere. And one thing I realized when working with primitive reflexes is that do not test or trigger someone's reflex unless you've got time to integrate them. Primitive reflexes or issues with retained reflexes, they call it, is an issue that can actually really define someone's life because these issues come up in utero, and so they can completely control your life. And when you activate someone's reflex, you have to have time to balance them. I've been teaching this reflex work for almost 20 years now, and I remember the first time I taught the first reflex course, Reflex 1, in Germany. Would have been 20 years ago. And there were 70 people in the class. 70. And, you know, just watching how people can be triggered. And I remember even the person I did the demo on for the Moro reflex, which I'm going to talk about the Moro mainly, but when you understand reflexes, they really are a very broad topic and come into play over many aspects of your life. Often people who have issues with kind of emotional issues, anxiety disorders even, I mean, anyone with an anxiety disorder, they can have any kind of Moro reflex underlying it. So any kind of emotional personality disorders, sensory processing disorders, learning disorders, all these kind of things could have reflexes underlying. And I can tell you this, if someone has underlying reflex issues, it's the first thing you've got to address, because you can work with them and you can work with them and you don't get anywhere and nothing changes. Or you might get little bits and pieces, a little win here, but it, 2-3 weeks later, everything's back to normal. Because, they're a fundamental part of our nervous system development. That's what they are, fundamental to how our nervous system processes. So if you have a reflex issue and you then keep developing all through your life, we're talking about in utero, in the first couple of years of your life, you have stress in development of your whole nervous system. And I mean, just think about what the nervous system does, or your movement, or your cerebral processing. So, this area, even though in the whole NK kind of scheme of things is kind of a little bit obscure, really can be one of the most important things, and can be life-changing. You can have a client you get nowhere with, and if you can address this, you can completely change people's lives. Completely change people's lives. And this is what we're dealing with, the whole reflex. So let's delve into the world of primitive reflexes. Okay. So the first thing I want to just frame the whole big picture. What is actually a reflex? Well, basically, a reflex is a type of movement. It's about how you move. Now, one thing I realised some time ago, and this is something I didn't read in a book, what I'm showing you now. It's something I understood from my just understanding of human nervous system. Is there's actually three types of movement that relate to the whole three levels of the brain. It's called, what's known from Paul MacLean, which was a 50s of last century neurology dude. He called it the triune brain, or the three brains. You know, you may have heard of that before. He's the guy that coined it. And so the way we move actually is there's actually three different types of movement. And so when you think about movement, movement is about how you move your muscles and move in the world, you know. They call it the motor system. And so the motor system is about how we actually move. It's kind of interesting word. Most people think of a motor, oh yeah, I've got one in my car. I just got a new car, it's got a diesel motor, do you know what I mean? So you've got conscious movement. That means, you know, I can look at something and I can see my glasses on the desk and I pick them up and I want to look at them. Oh, they're dirty and I need to clean them. I've got the spray here, I can spray them. Do you know what I mean? And I'm doing that, it's very conscious because I'm watching what I'm doing. I'm consciously aware of what my aim is. And so I'm moving. So I'm moving every movement I do is completely conscious. So I call that conscious movement, and it needs your cortex. You know, it needs motor planning, it needs your executive function. So it needs all those higher levels of your brain for planning, so you can go, oh, yeah, my aim is to pick up my glasses, pick up the spray them, clean them. That's what my, you know, executive brain says. And so then my motor planning areas, they start planning that. Then they go to my primary motor cortex in my frontal lobe, Brodmann's area number 4, and it just goes. That makes then that has the corticospinal tracts, and they go down. And they, from the cortex, direct to your motor neurons in your spinal cord, and it moves, it activates the muscles necessary for me to carry out that movement. And that's conscious motion. So, you know, all the motor systems where, you know, you can see here I've got 3 different ways we move. They're all about how we move our muscles. The difference between them is what part of the nervous system like activates the neurons to move those muscles. So when we're doing the conscious movement, it's about motor planning. It's our executive function. And, you know, can be very complex things like, you know, if you're trying to, before I was trying to fix something on my printer and I was getting in there and, you know, looking in there, trying to clean some little thing because there was a sensor error, blah, blah, blah. You know, you're doing all these little things, but it's very conscious and aware, and they can be very fine motor movements. And that's the conscious motor system. It needs what they call in the triune brain, it's the neo-mammalian brain. It uses cortex and thalamus, and especially your frontal lobe. Well, your frontal lobe, it's not really any other part of the brain. Your prefrontal cortex for, you know, to decide what you want to achieve, And then you've got your motor planning areas, which are not the prefrontal cortex, they're the other part of the frontal cortex. So you've got motor planning areas, so they plan the motor movements, and then you've got your primary motor cortex, which is Brodmann's area 4, which carries out the movements. Then you've got what they call habitual motion or skills. It's kind of interesting, you know, when, you know, for the last 10 years I've run an RTO, and you know your skills and knowledge, and you learn all this blah, blah, blah. Then you realise is a skill is the ability to do something, and its ability to do something competently, we would say in an RTO, but it's the ability to do something well. It's like, for instance, those of you who can drive a car. I mean, when you were born, you didn't know how to drive a car, but you learned, or ride a bicycle, kick a football, or anything like that. It's a skill, and a skill is something that you do. And you have to learn that. And, you know, like take me, like my favourite pastime these days is skiing. It took me so long to learn to ski. I mean, I had to practice and practice and practice. I mean, I'm so stubborn. I mean, most people wouldn't have just spent the time doing it. And it was all about learning to get my muscles to move in a way to achieve that. So now when you know how to drive a car, you don't think about, oh, I've got to do this, I've got to put my foot on the clutch, or if it's a manual, if it's an auto, oh, I've got to put my foot on the brake, I've got to start the car, I've got to shift the gear, I've got to turn the wheel, I've got to look around. All these things you don't think about, they happen automatically. And this is done in the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia is like, you know, the way, my analogy for the basal ganglia is like a hard drive. And, you know, when you get a computer, for example, you buy a new computer, okay, got a new computer. Okay. So I got my new computer. And I need software on it. Well, I've got some software on it. I mean, you need the operating system and some basic programs, or it doesn't even work. And it's like our basal ganglia is like that. When we're born, we're born with the with some basic programs, like we've got the suck the boob program, we've got the crawl program, and probably even the walk program. And even when you watch other animals like puppy dogs when they're growing up, they've got all these programs that they just know how to do. And even the sucking reflex is one of the primitive reflexes. And I'll talk about reflexes in a minute. But we still have these programs that are loaded on our hard drive. But then as we grow up, we learn new skills, like we learn how to drive or ride a bicycle, kick a football or ski or anything like that, or any kind of sport. Or you might need skills in your work. Say everyone who's a kinesiologist, how long did it take you to learn to pause lock? That's a good one. Pause lock. I mean, some people it takes a long time, or learns to muscle test, because it's all skill. And so when it's a skill, it's what you do. It's something you do. They call it non-declarative memory, because you can't say it. You can't declare it, where declarative memory is something that you can say. And so this is in the basal ganglia, which is part of the limbic system, which is, you know, part of the triune brain. And it's called the paleomammalian brain because it's in the oldest of mammals. Then you've got reflex movement, which is in the reptilian brain. And this is mediated by the cerebellum and the brainstem. And so the way, even with the emotional processing, you can divide it into the 3 levels of the brain. Like you've got your conscious emotion in the conscious, with the neomammalian brain. You've got your subconscious emotion in the paleomammalian brain, and you've got your unconscious emotions in your reptilian brain. So the word primitive reflex is a definition. So sorry to, everyone, people, ooh, primitive reflexes, ooh, it's like, well, all it means, a primitive reflex is a reflex that's present in a baby, that should be present in a baby when it's born. That's the definition. Okay. So, we have, it's kind of interesting that we have these whole idea of that primitive reflexes, which some of the reflexes taught in that primitive reflexes workshops don't come on until postnatal, so they're technically not primitive reflexes. But, you have to understand that, the meaning. But we have all kinds of reflex. Everyone might be, and that can be even to do with our, smooth muscle and everything. Like there's the gastrointestinal reflex, for example. Sounds fancy, but it means, how many times have you had a big meal and then all of a sudden you have an urge to defecate? And that was, that's what the, that's a reflex, because it fits all the definitions of a reflex. And this definition I have of a reflex is my own. This is my own understanding. I didn't read it in a book, but basically all reflexes have three components. They're all triggered by sensory stimulus, all of them. And I'll talk about what I mean by sensory stimulus, because it's more than just what we think about the five senses. You have some reptilian brain processing, so it's usually in the brainstem and cerebellum, but there are some that are just down in the, there are some reflexes that are just down in the, say, in the spinal cord, for example, like the stretch reflex. Have you ever, the stretch reflex is when you pick something up really heavy. Have you ever picked up something so heavy that your hand just lets go, it just goes, you just drop it? That's a stretch reflex. It's mediated by spindle cells. And then there's a motor response. So there's always finishes with a motor response, usually by the reticular formation, except in the case like the stretch reflex, for example, because that just is in the spinal cord where the motor neurons are. So the, and I'll talk about the reticular formation in a minute. So this is my own personal understanding. So you won't find this written in a book anyway, unless I write one. One day I'll write one. But anyway, so all reflexes have these things. There's a sensory stimulus, brainstem, cerebellum, motor response. So what do I mean by senses? That's the next question. So all senses can trigger reflexes, and this is something that I understood, because I understood it 20 years ago, because, like back then, Sally Goddard was all the big cheese in reflexes, and then later there's some few other people came around, like Svetlana Maksutskova and others that have written all kinds of things. And, they talk about reflexes in different ways, but my way of looking at it was I wanted to understand it neurologically, because all senses are neurological, all reflexes are a neurological event, because at the end of every reflex is you're moving a muscle. So we've got five senses. So usually we say, okay, there's five senses, auditory, visual, touch, smell and taste. But also we've got the two special senses, which are position senses. So what position means is about the position of the body in space. And so this is proprioception and vestibular. And so a lot of the primitive reflexes are proprioception, vestibular, and there's some touch ones. So if you look at Sally Goddard's work, for example, it's all just those three senses, nothing more. And when I understood that, that's, you know, when I wrote Reflex, my Reflex 1 course, it was just basically Sally Goddard's Reflexes. And so it was just those three senses. Then I realised when I was looking at it, you have to look at the visual, auditory, smell and taste as well. So that became the Reflex 2 work because I saw that. And then the other thing that I realised was that there's another reflexes through the chakra system, and this is kind of interesting because at the time I'll never forget it. This is going back a long time. It was 2002 actually, so I remember it was the year Charles got married in Germany, because it was that same year. It was just before that his marriage. And he got married on the day before the World Cup final in 2002. That's how I remember things. And I was there with my family. But I remember I've been in England, and so there was a mutual acquaintance that we had. And everyone, you know, there was one particular person no one wanted to work with because of the person's energy, and they would go into this kind of startle kind of response, which, you know, when I'm looking at the Moro Reflex, the Moro Reflex is a startle. And so normally when you see like the normal tests that people have for the reflexes, say with the movement of the head, like the dropping of the head, or you tilt backwards, and you look at the picture that like I had at the front, which is a baby. So when they talk about the Moro reflexes, I call it the vestibular Moro because it's actually triggered by movement of the head. The vestibular system is all about movement of the head, you know. And I'll talk a little bit about the different senses later. But what I realised is that people were triggered by this person's energy. And I was just trying to understand her. I remember I was teaching Reflex 2 for the first time in Germany, and there was over 50 people in the class. And back then, you know, it was before data projectors. We were still using the overhead projectors, and I used to carry all these, you know, transparencies, like a whole stack of them with different pictures that I would use in different workshops. And I'd left them in my room, and I had to go back and get them, and I was thinking about it. And I remember thinking about, what is it? Why do people go into this like startle, shock kind of reaction? And it was like a typical Moro reaction. Like the Moro reflex is about a startle. Like you react, you go into this kind of reaction space. So when you do the vestibular Moro, you're like, people move their head back, and the whole thing goes out. They go into this whole startle, and it triggers fear. So if you don't integrate your Moro reflex, so it should appear, you know, it should be present at birth and integrate, you know, maybe 4 to 6 months after postnatal. If it does not, your whole life is defined by this startle. So you just, you know, people can talk to you, and you're like, ah, or someone can come up and touch you, and you go, ah, you know, like this. But people were going into this state by this person's energy. And I'm just thinking, what the hell is that? Because it's not any of these others. And then I realised it's the energy, so it's the chakras. And so when you understand the chakra system, the lower 5 chakras from the base chakra up to the throat chakra, they all have a sense associated with it. Like the base chakra is smell, and the sacral is taste. Then you've got vision, touch, and sound. There's even through Ida Nadi, it goes, there's the Manas chakra, which sits just above the brow chakra. It all brings it up there, all the sensory information. And so then I realised what happens is, and I call it the energetic Moro because it's triggered by someone's energy. And then later on, I did, you know, the energetic Moro in relationships, because you know, when you're like 9 to 12 months of age, the baby realizes that they're not the same as the mother. They're separate from the mother, and there's like a shock. And if you don't integrate this properly, you end up spending your whole life looking for re-emergence with your mother through your relationships. And, you know, anyone who's had dysfunctional relationships could probably have that. I actually wrote that balance because I was coming out of a dysfunctional relationship maybe about 15 years ago. Oh, 16. Yeah, 16 years ago, 2004. Okay. Sorry. So they're the different. They're the different types of Moro Reflex. So the Moro Reflex is a startle reflex that can be triggered by different senses. And so most people, when they work with primitive reflexes, they work with a vestibular Moro. But one thing that we recognised back then is that there's other types of Moro reflexes. But what I want to talk about, before we look at the different types, is how the nervous system actually moves the muscles through the influence of the brainstem and the cerebellum. And the first thing that I mentioned before back here, brainstem and cerebellum, and you know, when you look at the motor response, it says usually by the reticular formation. And so that's the reticular formation. It's called, that is the brainstem. If you look over here, you can see the brainstem going down there. And you can see the reticular formation has 3 levels. The one we're interested in is this sort of orange part here, because that moves your muscles. And the input to the reticular formation, if it comes from the basal ganglia, it means you move your muscles due to your habitual skills. So like when you're driving a car, your basal ganglia moves the muscles while you're driving the car. So you can, you know, so that happens like an automatic program. And you can even have a conversation and drive and like a turn and everything like that. You're not even really thinking about it, which is good. And then you've got the PAG as well can move it. And that is another point that comes into the reticular formation through emotion. So this is how your body reacts in an emotional situation. That's a completely different topic. Or the cerebellum and reticular formation can interact to move the muscles in a reflex motor response. So if you look at this over here, you can see here, this is your reticular formation and cerebellum over here. You can see this interaction between them. And so you've got some reticular formation pathways that go up. That's called the ascending reticular activating system. So that's to do with being very alert and aware. But the descending ones are to do with your motor system. So, I mean, there are other things it does, like analgesic effect and everything like that. But basically, you know, down here, when we're talking about how the cerebellum interacts with the reticular formation, it's about how we can move our muscles with response to some kind of sensory stimulus. And it's interesting, and I'll show you the different sensory pathways in a minute, is that the sensory pathways are like when we see something, we can get all this vision going up into our cortex, and we can do that. But also we can there's some of the visual information goes down into the brain stem, so we can move our muscles in response to a visual stimulus. Like if you see something in the corner of your eye, you might just look around and say, what's that? It's called the visual orientation reflex. The same with the auditory system as well. Like you hear there's a noise in the background, you might turn around and go, what was that? So it's an auditory orientation reflex. So it's just an automatic thing that's triggered and operated by your reptilian brain. So you don't even have to think about it, you don't have to plan it, nothing. It just happens. So the cerebellum you can see back here, it means little brain. It's another picture of it there. That's the different lobules. They're kind of anatomical subdivisions. They're not functional. This is probably one of there's two important ways they divide the cerebellum. This is the by input, where the mossy fibers come in. So these pink areas are called the spinocerebellum because they come from the spinal cord. And these blue areas are the pontocerebellum, so because the inputs come from the pons, which is part of the brainstem. It's you look here, this is the pons here. You can see all this input going into the cerebellum. It has very important functions. The cerebellum is a modulator and an adjuster. And if the cerebellum is not working well, you get a mismatch between your perceived outcome or where you want to be and where you actually are. You know, the cerebellum keeps you aligned to your goal. So the pontocerebellum has a lot. It modulates his emotions, thought process, and visual information, auditory information. So it's very important in those kind of things. And then this down here, the green, is a vestibular cerebellum, and so that's a really ancient, oldest. Even like an eel has a vestibular cerebellum, and that's just information from the vestibular system. This is a picture of the zones. This is the output of the cerebellum. You can see you've got these nuclei, and I'll show you why they're important, because they're your actually outputs. And the cerebellar cortex, which sits above it, is actually modulating the flow of information through the nuclei like this. So what you can see there is that you have, here you've got the cerebellar nuclei, you've got the input comes into the cerebellar cortex, it comes here. So the information flows there, but the cerebellar cortex modulates it. And then there's this feedback from the Russian hackers. No? Okay. I always blame the Russian hackers. Anyway, and so there's feedback from the inferior olive, and so they, and the climbing fibers and everything like this, so they all sort of do this loop. Yeah, and that's all part of the modulation and adjustment of the information. So it's depending where the information comes in, and the information's coming in from this one. This is the important one. From the pons, from the spinocerebellum, the spinal cord. So this can be somatosensory. It's somatosensory information. So it could be proprioceptive, which is about your position of your body. So something like your postural reflexes is important. Also your touch as well. Somatosensory is two things. It's touch and proprioception are both somatosensory. And so the pontocerebellum, where you got your visual, auditory and emotional thought, and vestibular cerebellum to do with your vestibular pathways. So some important Moro reflexes. You've got the vestibular Moro, which is triggered by the movement of the head. This is the one, the classic one you see when you know, if you picked up Sally Goddard's book or anyone. Now these days, when you search primitive reflexes on Google, you get, like, every man and his dog's got a book on it now. It's like there's so much information out there, but they're all just rehashing the same thing. they all try to understand it. They all treat it through movement, which is important. And I think if you want to have an effective program for dealing with reflexes, you treat it through movement. And so the vestibular Moro is the original one, if you like. It's what people mostly call the Moro reflex. I call it the vestibular Moro because it's triggered by movement of the head. Now, the standard test is you get someone to stand upright, put their arms over their shoulders and tip backwards, and you catch them. And that should just flow easily, but if they've got a problem, their arms fling out and everything like this. The visual Moro is triggered by by a visual stimulus. See, there's a mistake. Obviously got visual processing problems, but anyway. So it's triggered by the visual stimulus. So, you know, typically, you know, if you throw someone a ball, for example, and they freak out, or another test for it is their eyes don't converge. If you put a pen and you bring it close, their eyes should converge. They can't converge their eyes. The auditory one, this is one you find a lot, and it's often especially in school children, because they can be triggered by the sound of someone's voice, someone's particular voice, and it can completely shut down their brain. And so you just, if you've got an auditory Moro, you can't listen. You know, you can't hear what people are telling you. And then you've got what somatosensory Moro. That's something I just made up today, but basically it exists, but we've never really dealt with it. Basically, if someone comes up and, you know, have you ever comes someone and touch someone and they jump a million miles in the air? It's probably a spinal gland, but anyway. But it's triggered by touch. And then you've got the energetic Moro. It's triggered by someone's negative energies. So I'll go through the different senses. So the vestibular Moro. So the vestibular system mediates reflexes in response to movement of the head. So the vestibular system only does reflexes. There's a little bit that goes up to the cortex, so that's like your awareness of your head's position in space, but you've got things like the vestibular spinal reflex, which is to do with body movement, the vestibular ocular reflex, which is to do with eye muscle movement, the vestibular neck riding reflex, which keeps your head upright. It just, you know, you just need to have your head upright. The vestibular system's fully developed by 5 to 6 months in utero, and the Moro should integrate by 4 to 6 months postnatal. Like it should disappear. Okay. So this is what the inner ear looks like, and this is a vestibular system there, and this is the cochlea. I think this was the best looking picture I could find. They're good colours, eh? I like them. And the vestibular system has 5 receptors there. You've got the 3 semicircular canals and the utricle and the saccule. But what happens, it sends information, and this is a good picture, it sends information in. Some of it goes to the vestibular nuclei, some of it straight to the cerebellum. And there's the vestibular nuclei project into the cerebellum. That's the vestibular cerebellum, by the way. And then from there, they will interact with a reticular formation. And there are some direct tracks with the vestibular system that bypass the reticular formation. And what they will do is move the body muscles in response to movement of the head. So have you ever been standing up and you go to tip over and then your leg flings out? That's a vestibular spinal reflex. The vestibular ocular reflex, on the other hand, is when your eye muscles move with respect to movement of the head. So the So that's called the vestibular ocular reflex. This is an example of the head moving from side to side, and you can activate it very easily. You just stare at something and move your head, but just keep your eyes fixed on a point as you move your head, and that's a vestibular ocular reflex. It gets fine-tuned with the optokinetic reflex, and back here I think you can see that there's the accessory optic system where the visual input comes in, and that's for that because the vestibular ocular reflex only works when you've got major movements. When you've got fine movements, it doesn't work anymore. You actually get the input from the visual system to move the vestibular system. Especially important, say, when you're reading. You know, if you're reading and you've got your head still and reading a book, you need to keep your eyes focused while you're looking at some point, you know, like some letters on a page, you know, a sentence. And so that's kind of important. That's called the optokinetic reflex. And the neck riding is just a division of the vestibular spinal reflex, really, because it's just about the neck muscles and it keeps your head upright. And what's important about keeping your head upright, it keeps your visual system active. If our head is not upright, our visual system doesn't work properly. So the neck riding reflex is about keeping your head upright so you can then take in the information from the world. The auditory pathways, they again come from the cochlea that we saw here before. This is the cochlea. It's called the cochlea because it looks like a snail. This is where our auditory system comes in. That'll send information here through all these pathways up to the auditory cortex. You know, they all go zigzag around. But down here is where your reticular formation is. And you can see here your reticular formation through here. So there's some division of it that goes off, and it will activate it'll activate like the inferior colliculus, and which will then plan, the inferior colliculus will then interact with the reticular formation, so you can move your body in response to an auditory stimulus. So you're not really concerned with what you're hearing, it's just where it's coming from. Or if it's going to startle you, you know, like if you hear a loud noise, yeah, like this, that's a startle, that's a auditory Moro. So if it's a really loud noise and you get scared, that's normal. But if it's just someone talking to you and they've got that, maybe it's your ex-partner or it's your parents or it's your school teacher or it's a sibling or someone who you got some traumatic experience with, so you just hear their voice and you just go into this kind of, oh, like this. So that's an auditory Moro, because it totally shuts down your brain and you can't take in information. The visual system, again, it works with the superior colliculus, and here you can see these are the extraocular. This is about eye muscle movement, but it works with the body too. And here you've got these gaze centers, they call here vertical and horizontal. That's a reticular formation, by the way. They just call it, you know, give it a kind of fancy name. But so again, that'll be like moving your body with response to a visual stimulus. Often it can be just something, you might see something out of the corner of your eye and you look around, well, what was that? Do you know what I mean? But when you've got a visual Moro, you can't, because you're just, these visual stimulus sends you into the startle response. You see something, you go, and so when you have a visual Moro, you can have problems reading, taking information. Say if you're at school, like school children, they can't copy stuff off the blackboard or something. Well, now it's probably off the projector screen now these days. Just thinking of when I went to school and it was blackboards and chalk. but that's what a visual Moro would look like, you know. And so a visual and some certain visual stimulus will just send them into this kind of startle response. So the chakra and energetic Moro. I love talking about the energetic Moro, and it's kind of bummed out this year. We got because in Australia we had scheduled the reflex courses, and I know I was going to do them next year in Europe, in Kiev. And you just cannot do them online. You know, we can do lots of training online, but the reflexes you cannot do online. It's impossible. So it looks like they're going to be postponed for a while until, next year or the year after. Who knows when? But anyway, but I love the energetic Moro. It's something that's very interesting because it's when someone's energy sends you into a startle. You know, when people, how many times have you felt someone's energy and just go into this kind of, And so this is a picture from Leadbeater back in the Theosophical Society, who's got the chakra nerve relationships. And so you can see, that the chakras interact with the nerves. But the nerves then can go into the nervous system. Then they can go up into the brainstem and cerebellum, trigger a motor response. So they're your pathways for your energetic Moro. And so when I was telling you that story before, like all those years ago in 2002, when I taught Reflex 2 for the first time in Germany, I was thinking about this person in the UK who sent everyone into an energetic Moro, and then I just realised what it was, and then I came back and, I had my plan for the course, and I just put the plan aside and I taught the energetic Moro for the first time to that group of 50 people. And that was a kind of an interesting day. But you can see how the chakras so if someone's energy affects you, especially the solar plexus, comes into the nerve, activates the nerve, comes into the spinal cord, up, brainstem, cerebellum, motor response. So someone's energy just makes you go, like this, that classic Moro. So I called it the energetic Moro. And then later on, when I was in a relationship breakdown, like story of my life, but anyway, and I had a friend and he gave me his book on relationships. It's Stephen Walensky's book on relationships, and he's talking about the false core, false self. And I'm reading it, and what I saw in it was the energetic Moro in relationships, because what he was saying in his book, when a baby is 9 to 12 years of age, they realise they're separate from the mother and they go into a shock. Now, if you can't integrate that, you spend your whole life looking for relationships to re-merge with your mother. And so how many times you've been in a relationship and you've woken up and it's like, you look at the person, what the hell am I doing with you? Or you might say, the sex was good, but we just couldn't connect intellectually, or I'm happy in my relationship, but something's just not quite right. Do you know what I mean? It's not really connecting on all levels, or great sex but can't communicate properly. Things like this. So, well, it might serve you to have great sex for a while, but at the end of the day, you want to have more from a relationship and have more connections on different areas. So that was his idea. So I wrote this thing. I called it the energetic Moro in relationships, because I realised is that what he was talking about, I mean, that was the wound. Not only was that the wounded inner child, but he called it the false core, false self. So you got this like wounded inner child, and you get in a relationship with someone else's wounded inner child. How many people have ever done that? And yeah, that's what I'd just done. It was with the boy's mother. I'd just done this relationship with two wounded inner child, you know, and so that was kind of interesting. And so, yeah, so that's where I wrote that balance that I have in Reflex 3 about the energetic moral relationships, specifically targeting that issue of trying to re-merge with your mother through the shock of separation when you realise you are not your mother, which happens 9 to 12 months of age. That was Stephen's kind of theory. So if you have a look at the spinocerebellar tracts, so these are tracts that go from the spinal cord up to the cerebellum. And so when because I have to understand things neurologically, so if there's spine, so here you've got the nerve, so you've got the chakras interacting with the nerve, comes here into the spinal cord, goes up to the cerebellum. The cerebellum, that spinocerebellum, interacts with the reticular formation, you know, and the reticular formation feeds into the cerebellum through the pontocerebellum. So you get this, you know, this whole loop, and then your motor response. That's coming from a chakra. So there's a perfect pathway that can explain how a chakra can activate the nervous system through a reflex and through the energetic mind. There can be other aspects, you know, like, have you ever met someone through your sacral chakra and thought, I would like to have a bit of hanky-panky with you, you know, and you get all this motor response, but it's not a Moro reflex, it's a hanky-panky reflex. Do you know what I mean? I mean, but it's still, that's like it's a chakra receiving the information, sensory information through the chakra. It's like a sensory receptor, and all senses have sensory receptors. You know, like the visual system, you've got the cones and the retina. Auditory system, you've got the hair cells in your cochlea. Same with the vestibular system's got hair cells in the vestibular apparatus. All of them. And then, you know, you've got you receive the information and you have a motor response. Someone's just privately messaged me, can I balance that in myself? I'm still trying. Problem with the reflexes is that because they're so ingrained in utero, they're connected to the reptilian brain. So this is my take on reptilian brain issues. Reptilian brain issues are your most spiritual issues. They're the issues that define your life. They're completely unconscious. I mean, even becoming aware of your issues is just a huge problem. And then once you're aware, you've got to like resolve them. I mean, it is your karma. That's what they would say. It's your karma. It is what drives you in your life. So, you know, you can get a balance, but you need more. That's why when you're working with reflexes, you know, like you can, like in NK, we use all the acupressure formatting, but you need more than that. It's not enough. You need the physical movement. And I know there's many people have worked with different systems, and the most successful NK practitioners when working with reflexes is like the Blomberg's rhythmic body movement stuff. In Australia, another woman's sort of hijacked it, but you know, it came from Harold Blomberg. I met him a few years ago in Sweden. Nice guy. And But, you know, what you have to understand is that with reflexes, it's just not an easy thing. It's not like, oh, quick balance, you're sorted, see you later. It's like working with trauma. In a way, it's a kind of a trauma, but it's just not so overt. You know. And people that have traumas, often there can be a connection. I think it would be essential work to working with people with traumas, actually. You've got the different sensory receptors, but you know you've got here the ones that come in proprioceptors, and they come in and go up the brainstem. And then as it comes in, you can see here it stops in the brainstem and reticular nuclei. This is a reticular formation. So the sensory information comes in. So this would be for the touch Moro, which is probably you would call spinal gland in if you in all the different reflex works, but also the energetic Moro, because the energetic Moro is coming in from your nerves. So the energetic Moro is going to come in here, but also with the spinocerebellum and interact with the reticular formation, spinal cord, and everything like that. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I said I would talk about different aspects of the Moro reflex, and this is how I've come to understand it over the last, well, it's been 20 years since I've been doing this reflex work, and certainly the NK way of working is a very fixed way of working, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you so much for all your support over the last few months. And it's been a real challenge for everyone, and I think the challenges are still there. They're still there. But anyway, thank you.